thank you for your Sabbath day. Thank you for the message that we learned this morning. And this afternoon we will be waiting to hear another message from you. It's a health message given to us by Dr. Kirschman. May we learn whatever we hear today into our daily life to keep our life healthy for you. In Jesus' name, amen. Good afternoon. It is my honor and privilege to introduce to you our speaker, Dr. Paul Kirschman. He is here today with his wife, Dr. Rosita. Dr. Paul received his BA degree from Cornell University in 1983 and his Doctor of Medicine in 1990 from the University of Montpellier, France. After graduation, he did a residency training in anatomical and clinical pathology at the Westchester County Medical Center, Walhalla, New York. From 1994 to 1997, he earned a fellowship in molecular pathology at the National Institute of Health, National Cancer Institute, under the direction of Dr. M.E. Sobel, Bethesda, Maryland. From 1997 to present, he worked for and works with a variety of specialized laboratories focusing on various diagnostic, prognostic, and therapeutic aspects of cancer and other pathological conditions. Dr. Paul, thank you for spending your time with us this afternoon to share your expert knowledge in gluten intolerance. The time is yours.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you everyone for being here and for having me. Thank you for a wonderful lunch and a wonderful service earlier this morning. I'm not the world's expert on gluten intolerance, and I sort of came into this accidentally. The person I was really hoping could be here was my colleague, Dr. Shelley Gunn, who created the assay, which I'll talk about a little later. And maybe some among you, maybe one of you already has gluten intolerance, so you may know more than I do about the food and the suffering, or hopefully you have a mild case. But I'll hopefully be an acceptable substitute for Shelley Gunn, and we could. I'll try to move on with what will hopefully be a pleasant overview. Whoops, I have to reactivate this. Oh yeah. So this is just my introduction to gluten intolerance to give you some minimal understanding. Oops. Oh yeah, I got to push the other one. No, I pushed the wrong button. Oh, I see. So gluten enteropathy. Enteropathy is a fancy way of saying pathology of the intestine. Also known as celiac disease, and celiac is abdomen in Greek, in other words, belly disease if you want, and gluten intolerance. So once again, gluten enteropathy, and I'll use these terms interchangeably, celiac disease or gluten intolerance. They're all the same thing. And it's an autoimmune disorder triggered by the consumption of gluten, which is a protein found in wheat, rye, and barley. In individuals with gluten enteropathy, the immune system mistakenly attacks the small intestine when they consume gluten. This leads to inflammation and damage of the villi, which are tiny finger-like projections that line the small intestine and absorb nutrients. And, I got to point that way. Do I have to point? Oh, it's not it. Well, I'm pointing it at the screen, so. Great. So this is just a cartoon version of what goes on. Normal, what we call villi in the small intestine, are these tiny finger-like projections that, if you look at the actual surface of the small intestine, it would look like velvet lining the small intestine. And because these are microscopic. But what happens in celiac disease is that these villi start getting fused together due to the inflammation due to the autoimmune reaction. And below is just to remind you where the small intestine is. When you eat food, it goes down your esophagus, goes into the stomach, then passes through a sphincter into the small intestine. And this is where the pathology takes place, in the small intestine. And this is just under the microscope. I'm a pathologist, so I'm used to looking at things under the microscope. You have on the left normal villi. On the middle and the center, you have the beginning of blunting of the villi. And on the far right, you see flattened out mucosa. And this is what a cross section of those little finger-like projections would look like under the microscope. And so the pathophysiology, in other words, the cause of the disease, is, in a person with no predisposition to gluten intolerance, gluten, which is a pretty big molecule, is resistant to complete breakdown by the main enzyme pepsin secreted by the stomach and the hydrochloric acid in the stomach. And because of the chemical nature of gluten, it has a high proline and glutamine amino acid content. You don't have to memorize that. The small intestine cells continue to break down the gluten as it goes through the small intestine, and some of the gluten gets taken into the cells and also broken down into the cells. But also, a portion of gluten is consumed later on down in the colon. The colon normally has bacteria that love gluten and consume most of it and handle partially digested gluten well. For people with gluten intolerance, on the other hand, gluten triggers an immune system attack that damages the villi that I showed you earlier on. And this inflammation prevents proper nutrient absorption, leading to symptoms like pain, diarrhea, and fatigue. And malabsorption of nutrients you can think of it as a form of starvation. It's not good when you're letting nutrients you need pass right through and get excreted. Now, this is my attempt to show what's going on an immunological level. When you eat gluten, the main chemical component of the gluten is called gliadin. This is the part that binds with a receptor we'll talk about in a moment. But the gluten that's not digested gets passed through the intestinal cells and into the underlying tissue beneath the lining epithelium of the villi. And in people predisposed to it, they have, we'll get into it shortly, but they have an HLA-BQ2 receptor that receives this gliadin component as if it were a foreign object. You could think of this HLA receptor, which I'm going to show you in a moment, like a catcher's mitt in that baseball players use in a baseball game. And normally, this gliadin from gluten is not recognized as something foreign. But in people predisposed to gluten enteropathy, this HLA receptor, which I'll show you in close up in a moment, treats it as if it's something that should be attacked. What happens is the HLA receptor of these patients, which in a normal person would just not, it's just nothing, it's just gluten. In people with the gluten intolerance, it binds the gliadin, and this enzyme, which we'll come back to later on, called tissue transglutenase, will take out, deanimate it in key locations. That, in other words, take out amino acids from that gliadin, which makes it stick really well to this receptor intended for bacterial proteins and pathological proteins. But in like I say, in the case with people with gluten enteropathy or a gluten intolerance, it binds the gliadin as if it were a protein from a foreign agent like a virus or a bacteria attacking you, which it isn't. Before I push forward, this in turn leads to interaction of your histiocytes, which gobble up foreign proteins, your T cell, which there are two kinds, T killer cells, which attack cells directly, and there's another kind of T cell, a T helper cell, which finds corresponding B lymphocytes and transforms them into lymphocytes that make antibodies against the gliadin. And this doesn't happen in a normal person, but like I say, in someone with gluten intolerance, because of the nature of this receptor, which I'll show you close up, which handles gliadin like a foreign agent, your body starts attacking the epithelial cells of your small intestine directly and indirectly through antibodies secreted by B cells when they without going into too much detail, your B cells, a certain subtype called plasma cells, make antibodies against the antigens presented to them. In other words, in this case, it's the gliadin. So hopefully this will go forward. Huh? Oh, well, he was telling me to. Oh boy. I wanted to go to the next. It's just not responding. Oh, right. So I'm going to get to this what we're going to call the class 2 HLA receptor, DQ2, in a moment. This is just to show you that the genes for this DQ, actually for all of the human leukocyte antigens, these are histocompatibility antigen presenting cells also, in addition to detecting foreign agents and all. They're all on chromosome 6, and class 2 is on chromosome 6, and it's not going forward. All right, push to next. You're having a hard time too. Oh, okay, let me try again. Sorry about that. All right, I wanted to go through this quickly. I'll hold down again. Oh, I know, but it's just not changing. Oh, where did you point it?
Let me just say next.
Oh, okay, all right. So in any case, this is on the right, you have a cartoon representative of the receptor that recognizes the gliadin part of the gluten molecule as a foreign agent. And it shouldn't do that, but in patients with gluten intolerance, it does. And this is just a cartoon version of what the receptor looks like. And it's this, you probably can't read it, but it's this beta 1 that causes the problems. And you can look for the genes, the genes that correspond to that beta 1 unit protein and determine whether someone's at risk for gluten intolerance. Next, please. So, without going into too much detail, you can just think of these human leukocyte antigens, receptors, as something that helps cells detect self from non-self. And in any case, the human leukocyte antigen HLA DQ2 and DQ8 are the genes, in other words, the proteins from those genes that are associated with the glucose intolerance. Approximately 97% of individuals with gluten intolerance have the HLA D2Q or HLA DQ8 subtype, compared to 40% in the general population. The study of the using X-ray to study the crystal structures shows what I mentioned earlier. The association of these two subtype of the beta receptor, the proteins from those two genes, can be explained by the superior ability of DQ2 and also DQ8 to bind the proline-rich gluten area gliadin very strongly, and that is what causes the autoimmune reaction, because it starts getting recognized as an attacking protein, a protein from a foreign, whatever, bacterial agent that just shouldn't be there. And once again, we'll come back to tissue transglutamase because it plays a little role in testing for the disease. But that enzyme it plays a role in this gliadin portion of the gluten protein binding really, really strong to a receptor that it normally would not. Next, please. All right, so this is the symptoms of gluten intolerance. And this, by the way, and we'll come back to an image similar to this again, but there's a vast symptomatology which overlaps with lots of diseases. So none of these are specific to gluten intolerance, but you have to, if you're a clinician, and it may take time, you have to narrow down what's causing these symptoms. Like I say, these are not specific to gluten intolerance, but gluten intolerance can cause all of these. The main one is gastrointestinal, which consists of abdominal pain, diarrhea, bloating, nausea, constipation, elevated liver enzymes, abdominal distension, and weight loss as you're consuming gluten over time. The manifestations are sometimes not necessarily pronounced in the gastrointestinal tract, but you can have oral symptoms, dental enamel defects, stomatitis. You can have neurologic symptoms from gluten if you have gluten intolerance. You can have headache, brain fog, fatigue, peripheral neuropathy. That's when you feel, like tingling in your fingers and feet and things like that. Ataxia. And ataxia, Rosita, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't ataxia yeah, I'm not a clinician anymore. That's when you lose your ability to, your sense of balance. You have, you don't feel stable when you're standing up. You can have anemia, and anemia would be due to malabsorption of iron, B12, and folic acid. You can have skin manifestations like dermatitis or petiform, which looks a little like herpes. You can have musculoskeletal problems, and as well as bone problems, fractures, and pain in your joints. And women can have reproductive problems, female infertility, spontaneous abortion, premature birth, hypogonadism, which means low sex hormone levels. And children can have pediatric problems like pubertal delay, short stature, growth failure. And these could be caused by other disease processes as well, but gluten enteropathy could cause all of these symptoms, which is why it's important to make a diagnosis or to rule it out as a cause if you're suspecting it. Could move on to the next. Oh, could you the next one, please? All right. So diseases sharing some of these symptoms. In other words, the differential diagnosis includes non-celiac gluten sensitivity. This can have similar symptoms, but it's not an autoimmune condition. It's more of an allergic reaction. And also you could have wheat allergy. Those are allergies to other components of the wheat that act like allergies and are pretty acute when you eat the wheat, but it's not due to the gluten. And then there are a long list of other medical conditions. I can't say this enough: infection, cancer, other autoimmune diseases that can cause these symptoms. So you always need a doctor. I don't try to self-diagnose. Don't even count on a pathologist to make the diagnosis either, unless it's laboratory testing. I don't know, maybe some of you know this better than I do, but gluten-containing foods include grains, all varieties of wheat, rye, barley, I didn't even know this is triticale, a hybrid of wheat and rye, products made from these grains, breads, all types, pastas, all types, cereals, most types, crackers, cookies, cakes, and other baked goods, unless they're gluten-free, of course. Sauces and dressings. Sauces and dressings could be processed in a plant that, even though they don't contain gluten, other foods made in the factory might contain gluten, and there'll be trace elements in it. Soups, if they contain gluten. Beer, and I put the exclamation mark because beer is, kind of like drinking bread, but also in the past, and we'll get to the past because I try to take a biblical look at this too, but there was a time Like when the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, everyone was drinking beer because if you drank the water from the Nile River, you get infectious diarrhea and die. So beer was just a common staple, and I don't mean like 12% beer, but I mean really weak beer because alcohol would kill bacteria. So everyone was drinking beer in Egypt. Babies, everyone. I mean, it just wouldn't. And it wasn't until I don't know when, was it in the 1600s or something, or maybe in Asia they already knew it, but when tea was discovered in Europe, that was the only time people could start drinking water without worrying about getting some horrible parasitic disease. They didn't even know what they were getting, but they'd get parasites and bacteria. Other foods. Oh, and one more note on the beer if you go back there, because I have a warped mind, and I'm not Seventh-day Adventist, but you would wonder about, what about whiskey and other grain alcohols? Well, the good news is for people who like, who aren't Seventh-day Adventists, is that, in the distillation process, the proteins don't remain because the alcohol evaporates, condenses, and goes to the other side. So I was thinking, you can drink grain alcohol and not suffer gluten intolerance. So, just a detail, but we can move on. So other foods that may contain gluten are malt, hydrolyzed wheat protein, wheat starch, soy sauce. Some brands, because they're processed in factories where there's gluten from other sources. Seasonings, because some contain wheat flour or malt. And note that some foods may appear gluten-free. Well, this is kind of redundant, but may actually contain traces of gluten because of cross-contamination. So always, we're blessed because in the United States, things, when they're labeled gluten-free, have to be gluten-free. As far as I know, maybe someone here will contradict me. So always check food labels carefully if you do have a gluten intolerance to make sure that they're gluten-free. Next, please. And before I talk about biblical times, Rosita sent me a YouTube video. What's it called again? Doctors Committee. And I learned something fascinating about the whole gluten intolerance industry. It's about a $15 billion a year industry, and because of the concern many people have that they're intolerant to gluten. And of that, it's really a small percentage that actually have celiac disease and are really gluten intolerant. But apparently, many people who are on a gluten-free diet benefit from the gluten-free diet, probably because it's a healthier diet than the normal consumption of products containing gluten, cakes and junk food and all that. They're not going to be going to McDonald's or ordering Domino's pizza and stuff like that. So they feel healthier on the gluten-free diet, even though they don't have a gluten intolerance. And that really surprised me because I'm fortunate or blessed not to have gluten intolerance, so I never thought about any of this, and I just thought it was some crazy fad that some people are, it's imaginary. But no, gluten intolerance is a real disease, but some people benefit from a gluten-free diet because of the nature of the gluten-free foods on the market. So I tried out, this is an AI search, I try to figure out if there's any link or anything in the Bible that mentions gluten intolerance, and unfortunately I couldn't find anything that was substantial. But what probably happened in biblical times, and I wanted to mention this since this is a church, is that it was probably not understood, and while people probably suffered from it, and consider how important grain was in biblical times. Bread this, bread that. The Messiah came from Bethlehem, which means the house of bread. And I don't have to tell you all the references to bread in the Bible. In any case, while people probably had the disease, it was probably attributed to other causes, like spiritual affliction or general poor health. And it wasn't until the 20th century where the link between grain and the disease would be identified. Although as early as the 1st or 2nd century, a Greek physician, Areteus of Cappadocia, I thought it was probably some Greek guy called celiac, but no, celiac means abdomen. But a Greek physician, Areteus of Cappadocia, referred to the abdominal disorder he called coliacosis, which is where we get the word in English celiac disease. I think I have next, please. All right. So like I say, it was probably undiagnosed in biblical times due to lack of medical knowledge, and there was probably widespread suffering of the disease amongst people who carry the trait because of that would manifest itself as unexplained illness, particularly in children, because in people the most predisposed, and we'll get to the range of risk later on, if they were at high risk of developing the disease, they would suffer, and nobody knew they were suffering from that, and they were being given bread and other grain products to, in an attempt to feed them. And there was probably a high mortality in biblical times from it, and once again, the diagnosis would have not been made. The causes were probably misinterpreted. Next, please. And so back in biblical times, as I mentioned earlier, it was a diet pretty rich in gluten. And grain, particularly wheat and barley, was a major staple of the biblical diet. And bread was fundamental. Bread was typically made from barley flour in the early Israelite period. And wheat and flour later on was eaten at every meal and provided 50 to 70% of a person's daily caloric intake. In the land of milk and honey, grain was considered one of the 7 species of the land of Israel, with alongside grapes, olives, figs, pomegranates, and dates. There were grain rituals in the Bible. Notably, make sure I get it right now. I think it's Passover. Yeah, Passover is the barley. Is based on the ripening of the barley. When you actually celebrate Passover, you have to see it. I'm no expert, but it has to start turning green or something like that. And wheat is the basis of Pentecost. It's a celebration of the wheat harvest. So, gluten was there all along. And is there one more? And so what probably has happened, though, over time, is as people figured out how to breed crops and all, if we would compare the bread we eat today to biblical times, it probably has a lot more gluten in it because they wanted to make bread as rich and filling and pleasant to eat as possible. So the bread we eat today would probably have a lot more gluten in it than back in biblical times, which would also explain maybe a heightened awareness in our modern times. We can move on to the next one. So I'll talk to you a little about a test which can completely rule in or rule out whether you have celiac disease or at risk for celiac disease. And once again, Shelley Gunn is the person I wanted to come and talk about that, but she lives in San Antonio, and she comes in the middle of the week once a month, so it'd be kind of a hardship. So what is celiac disease? Well, we went into that. There is genetic testing available, designed and developed by Targeted Genomics. Celiac disease is the specialty of Targeted Genomics. And Gluten ID, which I'll mention again, is the only FDA-cleared celiac genetic test assessing risk as well. The laboratory is in Irvine, California. You can move to the next, please. And there's the building. Pacific DX is where the testing is done. Once again, this is redundant, but just in case you ever do get genetic testing, it's the DQ2 and DQ8 genes that are associated with celiac disease. And if you don't have DQ2 or DQ8, you don't have celiac disease, and you're not at risk for it. We can go to the next, please. So in the numbers, and this is kind of cut off, but you have that picture on the left side. There are 3 million Americans with celiac disease, but 2 million don't know. Celiac disease affects 1% of the world population. That means an estimate of 3 million Americans in the United States have it. However, only 30% have been diagnosed. We can move to the next, please. One study says that if you have a first-degree relative, parent or child or sibling in your family, you have a 1 in 22 chance of developing celiac disease in your lifetime. And we can move to another, the next one. And 10 things you might not know about celiac disease. Well, in another study, well, once again, I'll repeat this. Once again, only people with the DQ2 gene and the DQ8 gene, for that little beta part of the HLA receptor I showed you, will develop celiac disease. And in another study, 1 in 100 people worldwide have that. I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself. Approximately 3 million people in the USA. 60 to 70% of Americans with celiac disease are not diagnosed and are needlessly suffering. A positive history increases the risk to 1 in 10. And I know that's different from the 1 in 2. This is another study. This study says 1 in 10 chance of developing the celiac disease. Celiac disease can affect every organ of the body, and it's a cause of vascular inflammation due to. I remember I mentioned that enzyme that makes the gluten unit of the gluten bind really tight to the protein. Well, because of this enzyme is made in the intestine of in the cells of the villi of the small intestine, and the inflammation breaks down these cells, and these cells release this transglutamase into the body's tissue and into the circulation where it does not belong. And because it doesn't belong there, just like with the gliadin portion of the gluten molecule, this enzyme starts being recognized as a foreign protein, and the body starts making antibodies against this enzyme, tissue transglutamase. And it just so happens that endothelium, that is the lining of your blood vessels, all the endothelial cells have this enzyme on their surfaces, attached to the surfaces. This tissue transglutamase enzyme is attached to the lining of the blood vessels. For metabolic purposes and all, and it's attached there, and normally there wouldn't be antibodies against it, except because of the breakdown of the cells in the small intestine, releasing it to where it shouldn't be, and the body mounting an immune response. What happens now in people with gluten intolerance as the disease evolves is that your blood vessels get attacked by the antibodies against the tissue transglutamase enzyme coating the endothelium. So that's why. And I mean, blood vessels go everywhere in the body, so that's why, in its severest form, gluten intolerance can affect every organ in the body because of vascular inflammation. Now, people with celiac disease, the only treatment is a lifelong adherence to a gluten-free diet. Until relatively recently, there is an average delay of 6 to 10 years for an accurate disease of celiac. An accurate diagnosis of celiac disease. And without a timely diagnosis, the disease can lead to intestinal cancer, anemia, infertility, and more. There are more than 200 symptoms associated with gluten intolerance, and many people with gluten intolerance are asymptomatic and still at risk for long-term complications. Next projection, please. So, accurate diagnosis of celiac disease, in other words, ruling it in or ruling it out, is important. It can often take a long time, but things are changing because of genetic testing. Celiac disease is the most common inherited, in other words, genetic autoimmune disease in the United States. It's also the most underdiagnosed. And according to the Celiac Disease Foundation, it takes an average of 6 to 10 years to establish an accurate diagnosis of celiac disease until very recently. Next. So I already, I guess, said this. So we could skip this. Next, please. And now, this is why does it take so long? Maybe I'm being redundant, but because of the different symptoms in the different organ systems that could be affected outside of the GI tract, it leads to multiple consultations with different specialists because you may not know you have gluten enteropathy and think you're having a skin problem, or you might think you have an infertility problem and you have no idea it's due to gluten intolerance. And of course, you might go to a person specialized in joint disease because you'd be suffering joint pains and not realize it's due to the gluten intolerance. So, so oftentimes in these individuals, they don't themselves make the link between the consumption of gluten and the problems they're having, and it takes a while to establish it. Next thing. So the underlying cause is genetic. This is a genetic disease. If you don't have the genes, you won't have the disease. If you have the genes, you will. And without the presence of the HLA-DQ2 or HLA-DQ8 genes, you will not develop the disease. However, you may have either of these genes and not necessarily come down with symptoms because there are different combinations of these genes and subtypes of the HLA-DQ2 and HLA-DQ. I'm sorry, there are variations of HLA-DQ2 that make it more likely or less likely that you'll have full symptoms of the disease. If you already have symptoms of the disease, then you know you have the symptoms. But if you don't have the symptoms, then you could predict the likelihood of your coming down with full-blown celiac disease. And in any case, if you do have those genes, it's a good idea to stay away from gluten, and not wait for the disease to be clinically evident. In the old, well, it's still practiced today, but a definitive diagnosis is made on 4 out of 5, the 4 out of 5 rules, which considers symptoms, diet, test results to confirm the disease. Next, so the classic way of making a diagnosis of celiac disease is based on positive symptoms. This is probably too hard for you to read, but you don't have to memorize it. Positive symptoms, positive genetics, positive tissue transglutenase antibodies, a positive biopsy. In other words, you look at the histology, which I showed you early on. You look for blunting of those villi, and a response to a gluten-free diet. Now, keep this in mind. 4 out of these 5 have to be satisfied. But I would argue that if you have negative celiac genetics, then it's another diagnosis. So you rule it out with negative genetics. But of note, and if you were going to do the response to a gluten-free diet, that could take like 6 to 7 years before you know your response is working, because you restricted your diet from gluten. And plus you have to go through all the hassle of assiduously making sure you don't have any gluten in your diet for 6 to 7 years. The positive tissue transglutenase antibody test, that could take giving someone a gluten-rich diet, like a few months or something for them to show up. So that's not too convenient either. And what it'll boil down to is the best way to rule in or rule out celiac disease without having to have a gluten-free diet or looking for antibodies to tissue transglutenase, or would be the genetic testing, which would basically, are you hearing me? If the genetic testing would basically rule in or rule out completely, so you don't have to bother with the inconveniences of the other aspects of with the other four factors in making a diagnosis. Next, please. Well, this is just showing you, how easy genetic testing is with the Kit for Gluten ID. Basically, you get what looks like a Q-tip on top of a little tube of alcohol, and you rub the Q-tip on your cheek to get some of your body cells, your cheeks, your body cells, the cheeks of, the cells in your cheek lining. You scrape them off with a Q-tip and put that Q-tip the other way around into the alcohol fixative, and that'll preserve the DNA for a very long time. And you can send it off to the lab for analysis. Next, please. That must be added in there by accident. Next, please. Well, this is just going over the, when that sample is received in the lab, it basically undergoes a PCR testing for the possible alleles of DQ2 as well as for DQ8, and then sequencing is done to confirm whether you have DQ2 variants or the DQ8 variant of the gene. Next, please. And our lab offers a comprehensive explanation. And can we go to the next? Could you backtrack one more time? This last picture, I wish I could show this to you here, the one on the far right. But basically, I mentioned earlier that there are different variations of the DQ2 gene, and combinations, there with off, like you can have two copies, one from the mom and the dad, one copy from your mom, and the other allele being normal. You can have the association of DQ2 and DQ8, and there's a range of possible findings that put you into a risk category. Actually, you can go to the next. You see that looks like a speedometer, green being very little risk and red being very high risk. If you do have the variants of DQ2 present or DQ8, it'll assess the risk of your coming down with the disease if you don't have it yet. Of course, if you do have the gastrointestinal symptoms and all, without having to deprive yourself of gluten or look for antibodies against the tissue transglutenase, you know right away that you do have gluten enteropathy. If the test is completely negative, you don't have gluten intolerance. It's that simple. And I think there's another one following that. Oh, that's just a review. There's a requisition and all. I forgot this was here. But once again, you don't have to try to strain your eyes to read the risk, but there are different combinations of DQ2, and the notation, the way they label these things is confusing unless you're used to it. But if you don't have anything, there's no risk. If you have a DQ7 variant of DQ2, it's a slight risk. If you have DQ7, don't worry about what these mean. But they're different allele combinations, and they range from high risk to no risk. And like here, it says there are 15 possible combinations. That's why you can't read what's on that table on the right. It's just too small. But this assesses all possible combinations, and if you don't have any of them, you don't have gluten intolerance. So it's really simple, yes or no answer. And if you do have the alleles and you don't have symptoms yet, well, it's up to you whether you want to keep eating gluten or not. But what you should also think about is that if you have the alleles, you got them from your parents, and if you have children, there's a risk they have it too. So it's in your interest to check out family members. Your parents, depending on how your age and how the age of your parents, they may be suffering gastrointestinal symptoms, and you find you're a carrier for one of the at-risk genes. Well, they can go and get tested too to see whether they have it or not. And conversely, if you have children and you have it, you'd want your children to be tested too, so they know whether to stay away from gluten or not. And so, basically, you solve a lot of problems very quickly by just having genetic testing done if you think you're at risk for it. And also, we're seeing a lot of post-COVID vascular inflammatory problems and all. That's becoming a big thing. And so everyone nowadays is thinking, vascular inflammation, COVID virus, and or the COVID vaccine. And I'm one of the people who think like that too. But as I learned more about gluten enteropathy, people with vascular problems, that should be something people think of too as a diagnosis to check whether the person has gluten enteropathy, gluten intolerance. And so this rules that in or out very quickly too. Right now, and I'm guilty of this too, a lot of physicians are polarized by long COVID and vaccine problems. In fact, it was a little over a year ago now, I gave a talk which David witnessed where I bombed, but I was talking about the risk of BioNTech, that is the Pfizer mRNA, getting integrated into our genes. And I think I got too much into science, but I'm still, very conscious about long COVID and secondary effects of the vaccine. But this opened my eyes up to another cause of vascular inflammation, which is, we're just seeing it, grow out of bounds in the United States and in the Western world. Vascular inflammation is a very serious problem with heart attacks and strokes and all, being a leading cause of death. So it's just something in the back of, that should be in the back of a physician's mind and your minds too. If you think that could be a possibility and you have cardiovascular problems or something, nothing happens all by itself. But if you have gluten enteropathy, you're immediately at high risk for vascular disease. So, and I think we're coming to the end. Oh yeah, I was telling you about this. These are possible outcomes based on the test. They give you like a little scale telling you no risk, low risk, moderate risk, high risk, depending on whether you have the variants for HLA Q2 and or Q8. And this is, about the testing we're doing, it's the only one that's FDA cleared and cleared also for direct marketing to patients, as well as cleared for the buccal swab, so that someone could receive a kit and rub their cheek on it, put it in the alcohol tube, send it to the lab on your own. You don't need a physician's intervention. That's $300, between $350 and $300. And insurances cover it? No, it has its own CPT code. Well, I put it this way: they should, because it's FDA approved and been extensive studying and all. So you never know. Sometimes you have to argue with insurance companies and all, but this shouldn't be a problem. And people could pay from their pocket too if they're so inclined. And if there's hardships, of course, they negotiate a rate for hardships. So I think I covered everything I wanted to say, and so now we're open for suggestions, questions, comments, personal experiences. Oh, and maybe, well.
Yes, so the biblical time wheat, it was called einkorn. I don't know if anyone ever heard of it. EINKHORN.
I didn't know.
And believe it or not, I have bought it on Amazon. You can order it. You have to.
Gluten?
Yeah. And I have baked bread with it, and it's true. It's much lower in gluten. When you mix it with water, it's not sticky like the wheat you buy in the grocery store. It's clearly much lower in gluten.
Oh, that's biblical wheat?
That's like
wheat.
the initial wheat that as far as they could go.
I have no idea. I didn't do that,
It's called einkorn wheat.
Wow.
For, I don't know, $20, you can get a large bag from Amazon.com.
I probably ate the bread then.
It's possible.
Yeah.
Oh, the French use it too? Oh, well, I didn't know. But I also want to say one thing about the genes. So there are proteins in the body and inside the chromosomes and all that that can turn on or off genes. Some of them are called histones, Histones. So if you change your lifestyle, the bad genes can actually be turned off, and the good genes can be turned on. So is it possible that over time, people eating, I don't know, too much meat, too much animal products, the bacteria have changed in their bowels from good bacteria that could give you good digestion to bad bacteria that cause the change, because the bacteria have these proteins also that can turn on and off the genes. So if you change your lifestyle, it's possible that DRQ4 and 8 can actually be turned off. I mean, that has been studied, that there are these proteins that turn off bad genes. So yeah, it's good. It's good to be diagnosed. It's a very small percentage of the population, but also if we follow our health message, it's very possible that those bad genes can be turned off.
And Rosita reminded me of two things I meant to say. That if you just have one allele, for the bad beta unit there, not all of your receptors are going to be abnormal. So if you only have one bad gene copy number, I can't do the math. Well, I hope I'm not saying something wrong, but it would be something like maybe half of the receptors will be bad, but the other two will have two normal beta units, and therefore we'll have a normal beta unit. So it's not homogeneously covered with bad receptors. It depends on whether you have one or two alleles and what they are. Because some of the receptors will be normal, but it's the abnormal HLA receptors that trigger the downstream autoimmune reaction. And the other thing I forgot to say is that normally the good flora in your colon, they eat up the non-digested gluten. But if you wipe out the good flora in your colon, they won't be eating up the gluten as successfully. The replacement flora won't be consuming the gluten as successfully, so you'd probably have worse diarrhea because, and not only that, but if you have advanced celiac disease, you have all the non-digested nutrients passing through your gut and into your colon, making more water secreted to maintain osmotic pressure in the colon, and you probably have a lot more diarrhea when you don't have the good colonic flora there. So colonic flora on the back end, on the downstream end, is very important as well, but we don't think about it as much because all the damage is taking place in the small intestine. But you'll suffer more if your flora isn't the normal flora, the bacterial flora on your colon. So,
Thank you for your presentation. I got here a little bit late. I don't know if you addressed it, but I'm very new to this concept of gluten intolerance. I just want to make sure I understand correctly. I know for diabetes, for example, there's type 1, type 2, one's genetic, one is attained, and then you could even get rid of it by diet.
Yeah.
Is this gluten intolerance kind of along the same lines?
No,
because I hear it's just genetic. So can you acquire it by eating certain things?
No,
or anything?
You don't get it by eating too much gluten. Otherwise, we probably all have died
That's
a long
what I'm trying
time
to
ago.
assess here.
If you carry one of the alleles, one of the genes, that lead to the defect in the HLA Q receptor, you're at risk for coming down with the disease depending on which of the defective genes for this DQ2 unit of the receptor you have and how many copy numbers. So the risk is from low risk to high risk, but if you have one of the bad HLA DQ genes, you're at risk. And if you have the symptoms, then you know why. But what this test can do is predict your likelihood of coming down with the actual gluten intolerance, the celiac disease. So you may be a silent carrier and maybe live your whole life fine, and even though you're eating gluten and all, if you're at low risk, but if you're at high risk, you'll probably develop the disease. And of course, Rosita reminded me, which I hope I made clear at the end, that if you carry a bad allele, it means you inherited it from your parents, and so they're at risk even if they don't know it, and your children are at risk because you may have transmitted it to them. And if you have one copy and they're lucky they didn't get it, so much the better. But if you have two copies of defective genes, each copy for that subunit, they're going to inherit one or the other, And if your wife has it, then it might get two bad genes put together, again, putting them at a higher risk. So if you or a family member has it, depending on the study you look at, you go from 1 in 22 to as high as 1 in 10 risk of coming down with the disease. So it's genetic. It's a hereditary disease. The only thing you can do if you're a carrier is get gluten out of your diet, which fortunately is easy to do today in the United States. But if you don't carry the genes, you're not going to get gluten intolerance. You might have allergies to wheat. You might have other problems, or allergy to gluten, but it's different. It's not an autoimmune disease. So you know right away if it's an allergy.
And then the last thing, thank you for sharing that. You showed a picture on the screen of a number of the way it manifests itself.
Yeah.
A lot of it was gastric, but you put a picture that also has like a skin. Like, does it show up in?
We can try to go back.
I'm just curious. How does it manifest itself in the skin? What do you get on your skin?
Well, in the skin, and I have to look that up again too, but because I'm not.
Yeah, that was news to me. I was like, oh wow, I didn't know you can have like a skin reaction to that.
Well, it's an autoimmune reaction to the skin, and it could. Oh, do you know if you can help me out? Yes, dermatitis herpetiform, and it's like bubbling. It looks like herpes.
Yeah,
Thank you for reminding me.
she would get purpley marks near the joints of her arms and
she was
knees
diagnosed
and
with gluten
feet.
intolerance. Yeah. Thank you for helping me out because I'm not a clinician. You can hold. You can. Oh, that's it.
Okay.
It's a differential diagnosis. It looks like eczema. Oh, it could look like herpes. Yeah. So I'm not. My wife is an internist. I'm not. And it could look like hives too. She was saying so.
What about the use of probiotics?
Probiotics? Well, that's an independent matter. I mean, probiotics would be good if your flora is screwed up in your colon, and I'm not an expert in that, but probiotics wouldn't really do any harm, but it wouldn't solve the problem of your body, reacting to gluten if you have gluten intolerance, and it wouldn't help the autoimmune reaction. I mean, it's good to take care of your colonic bacteria, but that's not going to help stop the autoimmune process. It would just the diarrhea would be worse if you had bad flora in your colon, because we count on the bacteria in our colon. You may have missed it, but much of gluten is broken down by colonic bacteria. It's a protein that's very hard to break down. So some of it's correctly digested and sufficiently digested and brought in through our small intestinal cells, but a lot of it passes down to the colon where the bacteria love it and eat it up. But if you change the composition of for whatever reason, your bacteria, pardon me? Oh, yeah, antibiotics, for example. Yeah. In chemotherapy, you want your colonic bacteria to be the normal colonic bacteria, the helpful colonic bacteria, and it's not my expertise, but if you alter that, the diarrhea would probably be much worse.
Years ago, I took a class with Colin Campbell, a nutritional class, and I think if I remember correctly, they were saying there was some correlation between the pesticides and wheat and how it affects the wheat, and there's been an increase in gluten intolerance because of the pesticides.
Well, it may aggravate, it may make the symptoms, may aggravate the symptoms. It may, because of just generally stimulating the immune system, increase the likelihood of your body reacting to gluten. It may have a role. And cause my allergies too, yeah. It's not my field of expertise, but I don't see how that would do any good, the pesticides. It can only make matters worse. And it won't affect your genetic predisposition. I mean, it won't affect the genes, but it may, if you're at low risk, it could increase your chances of coming down with it, even though you're at low risk. But I won't be able to explain the mechanism.
Like a DNA turn-on switch of some sort. Yeah. Right. Yeah, and they did recommend that you do the more organic wheat as opposed to.
Well, if you have gluten intolerance, you'd want to stay away from wheat. Period. Yeah.
That's.
Yeah. If
you're diagnosed.
Yeah. If you have that one of the bad genes for the DQ2 or the DQ8 gene, you want to stay away from gluten. Yeah. Why take chances even if you're not symptomatic? Yeah. Rye, barley, wheat. It's because I never lived with it. A nutritionist knows it better than I do. Yeah.
You mentioned about the test.
Yeah.
Does that test show you whether you have the gene?
Yes. There are 15 combinations you can have, and it detects all 15 of them. And if you don't, and it ranks them from low risk of coming down with the disease if you don't have it, to high risk of coming down with the disease if you don't have it. And if you don't have those alleles, you won't get gluten enteropathy.
So when should
Well, maybe passport isn't the best word, but it shows you. No, it tells you your risk, where you are in the range of coming down with it.
when do we need to take the test?
Anytime you want. You just take a Q-tip, and it looks like a Q-tip, and you rub it on your cheek, and you put it in the tube of alcohol that comes with
Yeah,
the
but
tip.
what I mean is, only when we have symptom, then we go.
Well, if you
take
think
the
you
test.
may have it, or if you have a member in the family, a first-degree relative who has it, that means you're at risk of carrying the gene. And now, if you lived all your life without any problems and all, you probably won't have it. But it's probably, the younger you are, like if you have siblings, and especially if you have children, you'd want to rule the possibility of their having the bad gene inherited from you, or the mother too. I mean, you both may have, Yeah, it's FDA approved for direct
Okay,
marketing.
thank you.
Yeah.
Darlene, you have a question?
No, I was just asking, what about ancient grains like amaranth and einkorn and
Well, Zita mentioned the heineken.
Yeah.
I'm not knowledgeable.
just
Yeah,
a little?
they just had less gluten in the past, so I suppose if you were at low risk.
Yeah, because I just heard that a lot of the ancient grains are less hybridized.
Yeah,
and-
I tried to explain that too. Yeah, they had lower gluten contents than today.
Okay.
Yeah, because they wanted the grains to have higher gluten content, and I don't know how they breed breed wheat and all, but they managed to come up with strains of wheat in modern times that are extra rich in gluten because that's what makes bread, yummy and all that. And so the emphasis was on having more gluten. Plus, I guess it's good for pasta and all that. Yeah, yeah. So if you had one of the defective DQ2 alleles of low risk, and you had a relatively low gluten content diet, maybe in biblical times it'd be fine. But today, now that everything is so gluten rich, that increases your risk because you just eat more gluten and increasing the risk of it being recognized as a foreign protein, which it normally isn't. Yeah, and in the United States, I imagine there's strict standards. I don't know in other countries, but I think they're pretty good about that in the United States. So when something says it's gluten-free, you can trust it. And I think I mentioned it's like a $15 billion a year industry in the United States. And I don't know if you heard, I can't remember, but there are people who benefit from the gluten. I think you were here, the gluten-free diet, even if they're not gluten intolerant, because it's a healthier diet for many people.
Any more question?
Oh, rice I don't think has gluten, am I right?
No, the starch.
Yeah, so that's good news too. So. Yeah, we were talking about pesticides earlier too. I didn't know. We don't do that. Oh well. No, potatoes are gluten free too. So.